Hi, my name is Mrs. Elizabeth Boy, and I've been asked to share some of my thoughts as to how things went for teaching online, teaching mathematics online during this COVID season. So, obviously, I have not been doing this forever. This has been about 3.5 months, so I'm not going to consider myself an expert, but I have learned a few tricks along the way and figured out what has worked and hasn't worked for me and my students. So the one thing that I did find was that pre-recording videos did work better for most of my students than live meets. Now the live meets were great, and I have an example of that set up here of I could project my Notability, my iPad screen, and I could write directly onto my iPad screen and students could interrupt if they had questions. This would mimic as closely as possible the classroom environment. Now at this point I'm using Screencastify to record my screen, so that's why you see my face here as well. And then I've just joined in with a meet. So this would be how my meets would go in general, is that my students would just see my screen. So I'm going to say, okay, well, the red and 4, and I'm talking about probability. So I can say my probability is my favorable over my total possible, or whatever I wanted to do. And this I could just write on it, and I could write whatever. I wasn't limited to what was reasonable to type. I wasn't limited to trying to draw with a mouse because I'm using an actual iPad, an actual Apple Pencil. So that was definitely nice and fluid. I really enjoyed that. Even when I was recording videos, I would tend to just use the screen record on the iPad, and that way you didn't get my face, but still it was as good as possible as far as just drawing and writing directly on it, and as close as possible to the way I might teach in class. So then once I had those videos, what I would do is I would post them on Google Classroom. So for example, I might have here 3 videos that were all about the quadratic formula. So I mean, it's one concept. I simply put it into small chunks. You can see 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 9 minutes. I definitely limit it to 15 minutes or less and tried for under 10 for each video, just for the sake of students not kind of getting bored and tuning out and also going concept by concept. So I made sure I used a quick little just description of what was in it. So if students went, hey, like I can use the quadratic formula, but I can't remember how to leave it with exact radicals rather than just turning it into a decimal, which video was that again? And then I've got it here. And then along with that, as well as recording the videos for each day, I would also have a quick little quiz of the day. So then this quick little quizzes of the day, you notice that most students didn't actually hit the turn in on Google Classroom. That was continually a fight. They would just do the Google form and submit the form, but then the link wouldn't always automatically submit it according to Google Classroom. So that was a bit of a headache for some families that were trying to track their students, and things seemed like they weren't actually turned in when they legitimately were. So then in here's what happens to be the Google quiz for this day. So when you see these formulas here, those I created with Equatio. So these ones happened to be just equations. I could also do graphs, and I mean, you can make their answers through Equatio as well to do this Google Forms. Unfortunately, at this current point in time, as far as I know, they haven't let you do even things like superscript to do exponents, but you can add on the Equatio, and then it works decently well. And again, that went free, like a lot of things during this COVID season. So that's how kind of my typical day would go. Is I would pre-record the videos, I would post them, I would post a quick little quiz so students could have a formative checkpoint, and then I would also have a live meet as well. So some students preferred just doing the videos on their own time if they were working, or if they struggled with bandwidth, especially if their parents were home and they had maybe 4 people in a household trying to access the internet all at the same time. Things got a little sketchy sometimes, but I would have the live meets because there were always some students that much preferred the concept of just meeting with me online and being able to interrupt me and have me repeat something right then rather than pausing and rewinding and playing again. I will be honest, though, that those numbers went fewer and fewer and fewer as things went along. So more and more students got comfortable and happy with just the pre-recorded videos instead of the live meets. As far as videos go, something that I didn't dabble with as much as I would have liked to, maybe just because I was introduced a little later into it, is something called Edpuzzle. So in Edpuzzle, you can post these multiple choice or written response or anything you want questions middle of a video. And if the student is ever unsure, then they can just go back and play it again. So I'm just going to keep talking over myself in the video because I'm speaking in French in this video anyway. But the way it works is I can talk about this and I can say, okay, I have a radius of 1.2 meters and a height of 75 centimeters. And then the question was, okay, which unit do we need to use for volume? Should we use meters or centimeters? And the students should realize that they should use meters because they're going to later convert to liters. So then you would answer the question, and then you could continue and you could keep watching the video. And then, if you try to keep going, right, you'll come up with the next question right away. And then again, you might have to go back and rewatch that little piece, or you might be able to keep going. So this Edpuzzle thing was a little even more along the lines of how it would have been in an actual classroom, where you might stop instructing and go, hey, what's the next step? What might we do? So that was a great tool as well. Another thing that you can do if you're using Screencastify instead of just projecting your iPad screen is that you can project anything you want. So if you happen to want to maybe present something on your calculator, maybe you want to put in a graph into y equals, maybe you are doing statistics in Math 20-2 and you want to actually edit a list or show whatever it is you want to do, you can project that on your calculator screen. You can also show apps, and this you can also do on the iPad. Sometimes I would present the screen there and just flip to whatever online thing I wanted to do and flip between that and Notability. So we did a lot of playing with things like this. Okay, if I change my length or if I change my height, and I can fold up the net and see what that looks like. So I would have links to that. It just embedded in my Google Classroom. I would have a link and say, hey, go play with this. And students could do that. That was the replacement, I guess, for handing out manipulatives and getting students to do that right then. So that's generally what I did. I did try a bit of recording live meets as well, but that caused some it wasn't as natural because then students weren't able to just actually unmute their mic and talk. They had to type questions because we weren't allowed to let anything from the student show up in the FOIP or in the Meet, just according to FIPE, if I'm going to be posting video later. And then I found that it ended up being a 25-minute video instead of a few short broken ones. And it just wasn't as nice in my mind. I didn't like it as much. As much as it took time, I preferred to pre-record the video and then have the live meet and have them as two separate entities so that either of them was better. So that's a little bit about what I did. Some other more global things maybe as far as how students interacted with it. There was definitely a variety of engagement levels. Some students are more engaged than others, and that depended not just on what grade they were in, but also on a lot of other factors too. Like I mentioned, I had some students living out in the country where they just legitimately did not have the bandwidth to support being online on my live meets. Or maybe they didn't have enough devices at home. And the school that I worked with, it was great because we could offer that students were able to come and pick up a Chromebook from the school and borrow it for the few months, which was phenomenal. Some students took us up on that, which was great. So by the time they had their textbooks at home and a Chromebook at home, they were much better set for success. But some of them still struggled with they submitted the Google form, but it didn't come through on my end. And there were enough students that said it and enough parents that said, hey, yeah, I was sitting right there. The student submitted it. I swear they did. And yet I didn't come through. So there were some tech issues, but I think that was just the reality of so many people being online all of a sudden. There are invariably going to be some hiccups. As far as how I kept students on track, maybe, I definitely found that if students were kind of losing momentum, that they would need individual reminders. So I could send out just a blanket email from the program we use called PowerSchool, where it would blind CC everyone in the class. But I found that was pretty useless, to be perfectly honest. Whereas if I individually sent an email to the student, directed to the student, and then CC'd their parents for some accountability, and depending on the student, after a while, I would CC administration as well. The individualized emails had a lot more impact. And that tied into what we all know of really it's relationship that's important. And if you have a connection with students, they're willing to do more for you. So they were more able to brush off a generic email. They were not as able to brush off an individual one. And then if emails fell through, sometimes I would have phone call. I did a decent amount of calling as well.
Mr. Hicks, can you please call station 0?
Sorry. So I would call home as well, potentially, and talk to either the student or the parent, whoever answered, and that was helpful as well. That was a little bit of a problem, though, sometimes because I didn't want my personal phone number out, so I would call from a block line, and that meant that sometimes my phone call didn't get answered. So email tended to be a good option. But definitely some students were engaged. And of course, the more they felt connected with me, the more engaged they were as a general rule, provided that there weren't some mental health issues or other things going on or connectivity issues going on. And that's not new. That's something you all know from the beginning of your teaching, I'm sure. As far as to talk maybe a little bit more about the live meets, at first, obviously, it took a bit of a learning curve. Students needed to know how to mute their microphones, and it was handy that I was able to mute all of their microphones. But really, they settled into it quite quickly. They were actually quite good at it. I was surprised at how adaptable my students were in a lot of ways when I did do the live meets. But as I mentioned, pretty quickly, they ended up finding out that if it was the same instruction in a live meet and on the video, that they preferred the video format so that they could do it on their own time if they were working full time or whatever it happened to be, or just playing totally through their sleep hours because they're teenagers and that's how things go. One thing, just as a quick mention, I have a child in grade 2 as well, one of my own children, and the video meets were way different at the elementary level. The students, there was just, you had to be patient. The students were not as adept at catching on to the process of unmuting and muting. They definitely did get better, but they weren't quite as quick at it as my grade 10 to 12 or 8 to 12 students. So you definitely needed to remind them, okay, unmute your mic, okay, mute your mic, and in order to get them to talk. And meet etiquette was a little more of a struggle. There was a lot more of just randomly throwing comments at the meet constantly, which was kind of an interruption. And that's probably, as you would expect, natural. I didn't do a whole lot of actual group learning on the meets, just because I heard back quite quickly that the students preferred the videos. So we did some group meets, but not a lot of group activities. So I didn't do anything in the lines of, splitting students off into different meets and getting them to do group work and popping in on them or anything like that. There are some ideas that you could potentially do, but I didn't play with any of those. And other than that, maybe just a bit of a wrap up. My experience online has definitely changed the way I will approach some things in the future. It reminded me that, look, a lot could be online. Even if we're in class, I could do the quick formative quizzes online still. I can do a little more of a flipped classroom where students can maybe watch the videos that I've already recorded. And then in class, we can do our group work. Speaking of those videos, it reminded me again that really we need to have concise, quick tidbits of learning and not get into the habit of just talking for 30 minutes straight. Even if you have students in your classroom, even if it is an interactive back and forth, they need a brief tidbit of information and then some practice. So that's definitely something that I was reminded of when I recorded my quick, 5 to 10 minute videos and then go practice and then go on to the next thing, 5 to 10 minute. I tend towards that in my classroom anyway, but that was a good reminder. And there we are. As far as work-life balance, I know I've had that question a lot. I really, to be perfectly honest, was not that great at work-life balance at the beginning, but once I got into a rhythm, it was a little better. It definitely is hard to disconnect from work when you're not as physically disconnected. When all of my work stuff was set up all over my table and I would still see it in the evening, and that students are doing their work in the evening because they're sending you emails and they're not available during the day because they're working at a grocery store and they're an essential service or whatever. It definitely is tempting, and I definitely did a lot more evening communication than I was supposed to. Just because you care about your students and you want them to succeed. But that's something that we'll have to look at a little better and try to figure out some boundaries maybe in the fall. So there's my quick points to ponder, I suppose. If you have any other questions, I'm sure there are a lot of other people around that may even be more of an expert than me, but those are my thoughts. Thanks for watching.